It's a clash of generations as Nihal Sarin takes on Nigel Short at the FIDE World Rapid Team Championship 2024. Nihal is representing the team from Ashdod, while Nigel Short is playing for the FIDE Management Board. This is a very exciting clash because Nihal is just 20 years old, while Nigel Short is, played the World Championship match in 1993. That's 31 years ago. The clock begins. Nihal opens with 1d4, and it'll be exciting to see how this game pans out because Nigel is known for his very free-flowing style of play. He has a universal style, while Nihal is very positional in nature. Knight f3, pawn to d5, and the other knight comes to c3, and Nigel plays his bishop to e7. Let's see where Nihal gets his bishop out. You can put it on f4, you can also put it on g5. He goes g3. Ooh, interesting move. He goes for the Catalan setup, but with the knight on c3 is not that common. Bishop goes to g2. Will Nigel get tempted in snatching this pawn? D takes c4. It's supposed to be the best move. Yes, he does it. He takes the pawn, and Nihal goes knight to e5, and now pawn to c5 played. He takes the pawn, so Nihal is well prepared. Queens are traded, and now knight takes on d1. Takes the pawn back on c5, kind of transposed in perhaps one of the main lines here, and he goes knight to e3. Very interesting move by Nihal because now Nigel can actually sacrifice this pawn and try to spoil the structure a bit, but instead he plays the move a5. Not particularly a great positional decision because this weakens a few squares on the queen side, but his idea is to push the a pawn down the board. White simply castles here, and now Nigel brings his rook to a6. Very interesting play. I mean, these are some very offbeat decisions that Nigel Short is making by putting his rook on c6. Maybe he wants to play knight c6 at the right moment, which is why he's played this. Now the bishops get traded. Knight takes e3. It's always dangerous to play Nihal Sarin, who's a master of converting these small edges. Knight bd7 played, and I think Nihal is not going to accept that trade of knights. He goes knight d3 back. This knight is once again a monster looking at these important squares. b5 played by Nigel, but now the c6 square is a bit weakened. Also the c5 square. Rook c1, fantastic move. Rook b6 played here by Short. Now is it time to get to the 7th heaven here? Rook c7. Yes, Nihal plays it. His rook moves into the 7th rank. Nigel is a bit cramped for sure. b4. He pushes. He's trying to gain as much space as he can on the queen side, but that's not helping because with every pawn that is being pushed, the knights are getting more and more squares. And now for Nihal, what's the next idea? Can he go knight d6? Does he go knight a5 to c6? He goes rook a7, which is perhaps the best move in the position, attacking the pawn on a4. It's not easy to defend it. Nigel pushes the pawn to a3. Now you can push b3, but you can also take the pawn and then take it back here and be a pawn up. Rook c1 played. Nihal showing such great accuracy here, saying that, this pawn is mine, I'll take it at the right time, but first let me improve my position. h6, and now takes it. Knight takes a3. And the other idea now could be to just put the rook on the 7th rank. Knight b6 played by Nigel Short. Maybe rook b1 isn't so silly, trying to pin here. He goes rook b1. Ooh. Wow, a crazily accurate game being played here by Nihal Sarin. Bishop d7 played, and he brings his knight to e5. Fantastic move. Rook goes to d8. and now rook to a6 would be very strong. Let's see what Nihal does here. Well, he plays the second best move, bishop c6, but that's also pretty good to keep up the advantage. And Nigel finds rook dc8. This little tactical move saves the day actually for black, because after takes you take back with the knight here, and in this way you don't lose material, because in the end of the line there is rook c1 check. So knight d7, knight d7 takes here, and if you were to take here on d7, I can take on b1, knight b1 and rook c1 check, winning this. So that's the reason why Nihal takes on b8, knight takes b8, and he plays his rook to a8, pinning here. King f8 played, and the favorite Nihal move now, king g2, so that this rook cannot escape with a check. Yes, king g2 played, king e7, and the knight jumps into b5. These have been 31 moves that have been played between them, but really Nihal has played so beautifully this game. It also showcases perfectly why getting into a small disadvantageous position against Nihal Sarin is so risky, because he's able to grind out such positions beautifully. Knight d7, and generally it's said that knight endgames are like pawn endgames, and so Nihal, being a pawn up, is okay to go into a knight endgame. You have to be slightly careful now not to lose your pawn on a4. Nihal brings his king to f3. It's actually a nice master class into how to convert an extra pawn. Knight c5, attacking the pawn on a4. Should you push the pawn or should you bring the knight back? Nihal brings the knight back. Nigel brings his king up the board. Nihal goes to e3. He wants to play king to d4, but if you try to push your pawn to e5, the d5 square would get weakened. So king b6, and now the king moves up to d4. Knight to b3 check has been played. King c4, and now knight check here. So trying to make white's task as difficult as possible, but Nihal comes back with his king to d3. Knight comes to b7. Now with the idea perhaps of going knight c5, king a5, trying to win this pawn, but the king moves to d4. Slowly and steadily Nihal is making progress here. Knight a5 played, and maybe it's now time to start moving your kingside pawns. f4 is on the board. He gives a check with his knight to c6, and Nihal goes king c4. Nigel shot gives a check, king comes back. So in this way, by sort of a roundabout way, Nihal is gaining that one move every time. f5 played, and now maybe it's a good time to push pawn to e4. But Nihal goes knight to b5 and says to Nigel that my threat is knight d4, trying to win your e6 pawn. So king comes up to c5. If knight d4 now, there will be king d5. He does play knight d4. King comes to d5, saving the pawn. And now the king comes to c3. Again, a very nice move. One square diagonally opposite to the knight is a good distance to keep so that the knight cannot check you easily. And now knight b3. Knight d6. And I think king can now start moving. a5, he pushes the pawn. King b4 was also a good move, but he started to push the pawn here. g5 played by Nigel, trying to create a passer for himself on the king side. But look at that pawn, it's running down the board. a7 is not really a threat because of knight b5, and so, but still Nigel goes knight c8. And it's a question now, do you want to keep your king on d3 safe, or do you want to go aggressively with king b4? Nothing of that. He goes knight to d4. Knight comes to a7. And Nihal plays f takes g5, h takes g5, and creates an outside passer with h4. Very smart thinking there by him, because the knight has been tied down to the defense of one pawn. e5 pushed, and now if you move the knight away, let's say knight b3, then there is fg3, so that's a problem. So Nihal takes on f4, giving up his knight. And what an interesting transformation here. He now has 3 pawns, but these pawns are absolutely killers. G pawn, a pawn, you can't protect everything here, and he sacrificed that piece quite naturally. g6 played, king goes back to e6, and now the king comes up to c4. He moves his king towards the g6 pawn. And the king moves into c5. The knight has to go back. And let's see how Nihal converts this. f5 played. If you take on f5, there is g7. Now the d4 pawn is hanging. The other pawn is moving forth. Nigel can safely resign here, but he's playing on king d4 played. And perhaps it's time to call it a day now, because even if you take on f5, I go g7. If you try to stop the pawn, my a pawn is super strong. So he loses here on time, and Nigel Short has lost the game. Nihal has won. I think Nigel might have felt that he was playing a little Karpov here in the form of Nihal, where he made absolutely no positional errors, and now Nihal sets up the chessboard. A very cool game. I think this game is very representative of what Nihal style is like. He is very strong tactically, which is why he can play such high class positional chess. Because when you are good at tactics, you are able to stop all your opponent's counterplay. And in this game, he was not able, he did not give Nigel Short any counterplay. His teammates congratulate him. He's playing on the top board of the Ashdod Chess Club. And it was a pleasure to see this game pan out.